We are back, and I am so happy to be joined now by Daniel Nichanian, founder and editor-in-chief of Bolt's Magazine, and their cheat sheet for the 2025 general elections is out now. Everybody go check it out. We'll put a link down below. But that's what we're going to be talking about today. Everything you need to know, or races you haven't paid attention to, coming up in November. Daniel, thanks so much for coming on the show.
It's always fun to join you.
Of course. So tell us a little bit about Bolt's Magazine's guide, the cheat sheet to the races, the general elections this year. And maybe we can start with some of the governor's races that, here in New York, of course, all we can talk about is Zoran Mamdani, but there are more races going on across the country.
Certainly. Well, it's supposed to be an off year, but at Bolt we cover local and state elections, local and state politics. So our sort of idea is that an off year actually gives us more space, even more room to drill down in some of the hot spots where there are interesting tensions, interesting conflicts, interesting elections. And so we have 180 elections on this cheat sheet. They're organized, hopefully, in ways that people can browse thematically based on what they're interested in. But the idea is that you may have heard about this big issue of school boards in recent years and the efforts on the right to take over school boards and restrict the rights of trans students, for instance. Well, that is the sort of thing that off-year elections can be about. You've heard about New York, the New York City race that you just mentioned, Emma, but there's, of course, other left-leaning candidates who are being inspired by Mamdani or say they're kindred spirits who are running in other places in the country. If you care about ICE or immigration, there's a lot of elections this fall where candidates are taking opposite positions on what it means to be a city, a county, a state, and have to respond to Trump on how to enforce immigration law. So those are the kind of things we're trying to pay attention to on this cheat sheet. There's so many places to start. The highest profile items on it are what you just said, the governor's races. There was two this fall, one in Virginia and one in New Jersey. Each party holds one of them. Each party is trying to flip the one they don't have or keep it. And no matter sort of what else happens in November, that's probably going to be the headline. Maybe interestingly on immigration enforcement, that I just mentioned, that's a very clear stakes, for instance, in the governor's race in New Jersey, which has state protections in place that prevent law enforcement from collaborating with ICE. And the Republican governor there, the Republican candidate there, one of their main promises is to end those protections as soon as he enters office. So that's the sort of thing we are keeping an eye on.
Yeah, and I there was some concerning polling about Cheryl showing her a little bit too close to comfort with Chidarella. I think I'm not sure if I'm saying it correctly. But that would be a massive problem in a blue state if that's where we're at for Democrats. And you also, of course, have Spanberger in Virginia, who is running. And it's interesting because I saw that they're trying to use like anti-trans ads down there in Virginia because the consultant class felt like Kamala lost because of the they-them ad or whatever. No, it turns out it was the economy and the genocide in Gaza and that kind of thing. Like that, at least there's some hope that Spanberger, might run away with it. We'll see. But those are the two big ones is what I've been
Yeah, those are the two big ones. I mean, the polls at the moment in both show Democrats ahead in neither of them by a huge margin. I mean, you're right, a little more attention paid on New Jersey. I mean, I think you're really right that the race in Virginia, the Republican nominee there has really, really focused on attacking trans rights as the issue she's focused on. I mean, particularly, among many things we could say about that, like it's also Virginia is the state that has been hit very hard by DOGE, by the federal layoffs, by the Trump administration. A lot of people there are federal workers. So there's really a disconnect there of all places for the Republicans to just really drill campaign ads, attacks on trans rights.
And so on immigration, what are some of the other races in the country that where basically if you're in your community and you want to protect other folks in your community from being terrorized by ICE, are there any ballot measures or key races outside of course, the New Jersey governor's race that people would want to pay attention to?
Well, I think the key question on, if you look away from the federal government on what's happening with ICE, is what are pretty much any level of government that has a law enforcement force doing about it? Are they actively going to collaborate and help and deploy their police or their state guard to help ICE? Are they going to have very strict restrictions against that? Even if there are restrictions, there are often channels of communication or loopholes. So what is being done? So that really means paying attention to the mayoral race or the mayoral policy where you are, the sheriff office, which is one that doesn't get a lot of attention, but we've actually talked a lot about Emma in prior times we've talked. But
Right.
the sheriff controls the jail, controls often a law enforcement force, and so that's often where we see the clearest contrasts on ICE policy. So for instance, this fall in Albuquerque, just to give you an example, there's an interesting mayoral race there where the Democratic mayor is promising to keep up sort of restrictions on collaborating with ICE, and his opponent is the sheriff. The Republican sheriff is running for mayor and is criticizing this idea of keeping a barrier to ICE. Another example for a sheriff race is Bucks County in Pennsylvania. That's the place that's near Philly, a suburban county. A Republican sheriff just signed a contract with ICE a few months ago to collaborate with ICE to have some sheriff deputies effectively act as ICE agents from a formal contract. And Democrats are criticizing that agreement. So that's really a kind of that's
Does
really
Pennsylvania, sorry, Daniel, not have the same kinds of laws that say New Jersey has that allows
no,
for that to
Pennsylvania
happen?
doesn't really have state level protections. Well, in part because Democrats haven't had. I mean, Democrats often do not pass protections when they control a state, but in the places where those protections exist, it's probably again because Democrats have had state level control, and they haven't had that in Pennsylvania. I mean, actually, Emma, to put a finer point on that, there's sort of a lot of controversy on the left in New Jersey because the reason that the Republican governor could come in and almost snap his fingers and end protections is that there is no law in place. All that's happened in New Jersey is that the Attorney General has issued the equivalent of an executive order, and the state Democrats who control the state assembly and state senate have actually not passed a law that would codify this stuff, even though there's been a lot of push there. So that's actually an example where state Democrats have dropped the ball on passing the protections in a way that would not allow a Republican just to win one governor's race and erase the protections.
It sounds very New Jersey. I mean, like there's definitely communities of suburban areas that are pretty racist towards immigrants, and that I would imagine those state reps are appealing to those constituencies within action. But Pennsylvania also, there's another key thing that people need to pay attention to, which is the Supreme Court in the state. Can you talk about that? Because it feels like every cycle we're on a razor's edge about which way Pennsylvania is going to go.
I mean, if you care about national politics and only national politics, that even is probably more important than the governor's race that we're talking about, which are ultimately about state level politics. There's a state Supreme Court in Pennsylvania, like there's in every state, and Democrats have a 5-2 majority on it. And that majority has done a lot, specifically on election law in the past 10 years. They struck down a gerrymander in 2018, a Republican gerrymander, and in the 2018 midterms, Democrats gained 4 seats from a court-drawn map. They've upheld mail voting. They have rejected Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election. So that court has really been in the news constantly on election law. So there's 5, 2, and 3 justices where Democrats are on the ballot in November. And usually, actually, what's a little confusing or complicated here is usually these retention elections for justices are sleepy affairs. Not much happens. There's often not that much money, but that's really changed in recent years. And this is really the first time in decades where there's a real effort on the part of the Republican Party to oust these justices. They're now spending a lot of money. This billionaire has invested a lot of money in sending ads to people, and they're trying to oust 3 justices on the court. It's a bit complicated. What would happen if they do? It would tie the court, erase the majority, but kind of set up a complicated multi-year process. We have an article in Bolts up yesterday that people could go read if they're interested. But the basic picture is that Republicans have no path to a majority on this court before the next presidential election if they don't win this fall, and they really want a path to the court majority before the next presidential election. I'll let you put together why that might be, but so that those are the stakes this year in Pennsylvania.
And you mentioned mayoral races earlier. You have Detroit, you've got Minneapolis, that's a major one. Seattle,
right,
where in Minneapolis and Seattle you have some really progressive challengers. We've covered the Omar Fateh debacle on the show before. In terms of the debacle being the DMFI rescinding their endorsement and how insane it was. But what is the status of some of those mayoral races, and what are the consequences of some of them? What are the most consequential races?
Yeah, I mean, you've named the ones that I was going to name immediately, and they're interesting because they have this similar. The 3 you mentioned, Minneapolis, Seattle, and New York, have this similar dynamic of a left candidate. Where I think they probably would just the 3 candidates, Omar Fateh, Mamdani, and Katie Wilson, would probably use different words to describe their politics, but they're all trying to take over a city governed by centrist Democrats. And that's an interesting parallel to see what happens. Seattle seems particularly interesting since the mayor trailed there actually in the first round in August. So that is almost sure to be at the very least very competitive in November, if not a pickup by the left. But there's a lot of elections out there. There's also interesting elections at the city council level in those places. Actually, there's DSA candidates in Minneapolis and other cities that are trying to gain ground. Also in some places in Ohio that I have on my sheet. Not necessarily the first places you think about as the places to look for left organizing right now, but definitely places to watch. And I was going to add something about Seattle that I'm blanking on right now. So I'll throw it back to you.
No. Well, we were just basically the progressive challengers, the dynamic being similar with like the establishment trying to push back against it. I mean, it is for all of those 3 instances. It is a bit of a similar dynamic.
Yeah, and I was gonna the 4th city I was gonna bring in was Boston, which was supposed to be this like a very interesting race this fall, and maybe the 4th place where it was particularly clear stake for the left because the mayor there, Michelle Wu, is a progressive, and she was facing a challenge from the son of the owner of the New England Patriots, who was spending a lot of his own money and attacking her from the right. But he did so badly in the first round in September, a month ago, that he dropped out from the race, actually. So Wu will not face any opponent. There's actually a general election, a runoff on the ballot in November, but it's just going to be Wu's name. So that was going to be my going into the fall. Those were the 4 elections I was going to name, but now, one of them has already disappeared.
Yeah, Wu has the benefit of incumbency there, but right. It is also just, I mean, that big money donor trying to unseat or progressive it's very similar in that way. I'm glad that didn't win the day. Go on.
And it's also interesting because you often think of these races as their own little islands because they're a mayoral race happening in Seattle and Minneapolis. But it's interesting to see the candidates often refer to each other. Like Katie Wilson has talked about Mamdani. She sort of joked that she's the less sort of smooth version of Mamdani. I think a lot of these candidates we've talked about have mentioned Wu as someone that they draw inspiration from. So, it's interesting to see these ties that are forming, and especially if there's more of them. I think especially if we see in New York City, if Mamdani wins, I assume he's going to want to play on those connections to make himself look connected to other parts of the country, or other mayors who think like him and want to do the sort of things he wants to do.
Well, it's also a natural fit because these cities are under threat right now directly by the Trump administration. So collaboration between mayors seems to make absolute logical sense just in terms of governance. Let's turn to the courts for a bit. And, when we're looking at prosecutors and other legal measures, even things that might be on the ballot that you want people to be aware of. What are the most important races coming up on that front?
Yeah. I mean, the immediate thought that comes to mind before I open it up is this very intriguing race in Philly. I mean, if anyone who's watching this has read or cares about the idea of progressive DAs, reform DAs that have sort of emerged in the past few years, Philly has been the place you may have heard about. Larry Krasner has been the DA there for 8 years, sort of has become an emblem for the idea of reform prosecutors, of the idea of trying to reduce incarceration or reduce the severity of penalties from within the system. And he won a Democratic primary in May, which was which was contested. And his opponent insisted he was not going to run as a Republican. That was it for that he was going to stop as a Democrat. And then he changed his mind over the summer. Republicans convinced him to run again. I mean, not that different than what's happening in New York. And so now Krasner faced a rematch against someone he already defeated in May, who's running as a Republican in Philly. That's really a tall order to run as a Republican in Philly. But I mean, to the extent that you care about prosecutors, that's really where you should start. So that might be the most interesting. Another one in Seattle, that's super interesting in relation to what we were saying. Seattle elected a Republican prosecutor in 2021. That's the only Republican in office in Seattle right now. And she really turned to more aggressive politics around crime, around quality of life offenses, and so on. And she's in huge trouble right now, heading into November. And that's interesting in relation to the mayoral race, the races for city council in Seattle. Seattle really is a place where there seems to be up and down the ballot the potential for left gains, not just in the mayoral race, but sort of an overall picture that voters are not satisfied there with the status quo and governance from the center or the right over the past 4 years. So those are races to watch, to see. There's been this idea that the reform DA movement has lost steam, has lost its figureheads, and there's definitely been some high profile losses last year. But
in San Francisco, though, but that is all tech guy, rich billionaire money. I mean, and they were riding this crime panic. I don't see the same environment being there for them at this point, even with all the money that they have on their side.
I mean, it's interesting you say that, because the high profile, it's not just San Francisco. The high profile reform DA losses have generally come in California. There's been LA, Oakland, San Francisco, which is a lot, but also interesting that there's a California dynamic. This year, there was actually the DA in New York City, Alvin Bragg, Philly DA, other DAs in small places that we've covered have faced similar criticism, that they've let their guard down and so on around crime, but and they're winning re-election. And they're willing re-election so far. I mean, I think the second thing that people should really be thinking about when they think about criminal legal reform and elections is sheriffs. We already talked about them. I mean, that's a very different picture. I mean, I sort of talked about a couple of sheriff races where we're seeing tensions. The overall picture, Emma, is that no one is running for sheriffs in places where conservative sheriffs are very aggressively helping ICE. There's been and places that are not red Republican areas, there's been an absence of candidate. We've actually done a couple of articles on this in both on Virginia, a couple of places that are very swingy, very competitive. There's no Democrat running for sheriff on the sort of like, we need to change our approach to ICE. That's not in a way surprising. Sheriffs by nature are going to attract a more law and order kind of candidate. But we've also seen places, or in the last few years, many places actually, where sheriffs have run and won on the platform of ending ties with ICE. So it's definitely doable, definitely possible. We've seen it. And the fact that in 2025, that was so many places where that just didn't come up at all. It's not even that competitive. There's no one is running. That's sort of a story in and of itself, I think, this fall.
Can you to take us back to New York for a bit? Can you talk about what's going on in Nassau County? I'm very interested in Nassau County as somebody from the tri-state area, but also because I believe that Nassau police are the highest paid in the country, and they kind of run the whole show out there on Long Island. And it seems like, it could go either way, because they were the first county. They banned masking in response to the pro-Palestine protests. It's a very cop-centered area, and kind of like the center of the suburban panic over crime in the city. That's the number one county I would think of, honestly. So what's going on there with their like local criminal justice, the prosecutors and the races on that front?
Great question, because there's a lot happening in Nassau County, which is a very, very huge county, I think above 1 million people for people who are not from New York. And so yes, actually, 2021 Republic, which is the last time the elections this cycle were up for 4 years ago, Republicans made a lot of gains in that county. They took over the county executive seat. They took over the DA's office, and well, on purely partisan terms, the Democrats are trying to erase those gains this year. I mean, that would actually be a story that is relevant nationally, because Trump, I believe, don't quote me on that, I'm saying it on the show, but I think Trump flipped the county in 24, which was a big deal as well, which had been sort of previewed by the Republicans' gains earlier in the local elections.
I don't remember, but that would not shock me whatsoever.
Yeah.
But like, Tom Suozzi's from like part of that district. If people know him on the national level, of like, that's the kind of right-wing Democrat that could only get elected there. Right.
And so Democrats are trying to flip back the DA's office, the county executive office. I think, from my understanding of the dynamic, they're definitely not doing that on anything like a criminal legal reform platform. I think I think you sort of already summed it up. At least on these issues, on police, the line there is to sort of agree with the criticism Republicans have done of democratic governance in the state, of bail reform. There seems to be a lot of criticism from Democrats in Nassau, of the Democrats in New York City, of Zoran Mamdani, and so on, and trying to triangulate there. So that's the dynamic, and super interesting that that's all happening within
20 miles,
each other. There's potentially Zoran Mamdani campaigning and winning a precinct, and a mile away there's this dynamic in Nassau. But that if you want two versions of the Democratic Party, those are happening there, very, very close to each other, and both trying to win new ground that they don't have right now.
Nassau County spokesperson, I should have known to cite one of our frequent IMers here, says our maps were ungerrymandered this year. So I haven't put two and two together.
So they're Democrats are trying to flip these offices countywide, but they're also trying to flip the equivalent of the county board, and the Democrats sued to redraw the maps of the county board, because they're actually drawn by the county. I mean, every state is different, right? But in New York, the county board drew its own boundaries, and that's so there's room there for Democratic gains by virtue of this court battle.
Yes, NRIM says you are correct. Nassau did flip to red in 2024, and it went 54-44 Biden in 2020.
Yeah. Wow.
So that's quite significant.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, lastly, what about ballot initiatives? What should people be looking out for to vote directly on something that could benefit their community?
Well, the ballot
Or
initiative that is
against.
going to take all of the attention is Prop 50 in California, which is redistricting by the Gavin Newsom redistricting initiative. I'm sure almost everyone who's listening to this knows about that. So I'll skip. Two, there's a lot else happening on the ballot, but I think the most interesting and off year is all these counties and cities trying to fund themselves and trying to fund infrastructure, trying to fund often things that are, not sexy necessarily to talk about, like school repair and a new school or a new transit line or a housing development, and that often comes down to these bonds measures. And so there's a bunch happening. There's a lot happening. There's a lot of money that is dependent on voters approving a bonds measure around the country. So that's really interesting to think of how much comes down to that at the level of just the basic infrastructure around the country, right? But there's also some interesting measures. For instance, Olympia in Washington is voting on a Bill of Rights for labor protections. It would also increase the minimum wage to $20, I think. But it also contains a bunch of other protections there in Olympia. So that's just the kind of measure that is happening around the country that is interesting to keep an eye on.
Well, Daniel Nichanian giving us a great sense of what Boltz Magazine has been working on and more. And you can find all of that at the Boltz Magazine. We'll put a link to it down below, boltzmag.org, and you can look up your cheat sheet to the 2025 general elections. Everybody check it out wherever you are in the country. If you're here in the United States, you can see what's going to be important coming up in November. Daniel Nichanian, thanks so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
Of course.
Hey folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.